I'm Michael Turner. Christmas night last year, at my own son's table, I was told to shut up in front of his wife, his kids, and relatives who suddenly forgot who I was. I had spent more than 2 decades giving everything I had to my son and the life he built. 2 decades believing that was what being a good father looked like in the real world. But when his wife rolled her eyes and said I was just taking up space, and my son backed her up, saying, "Dad, just stop, you're embarrassing us," something inside me snapped. It felt like getting punched in the chest without warning. Nobody spoke up. Nobody reminded them who paid the bills when things got tight. Nobody mentioned the house keys in my pocket or the years of sacrifice that made their comfort possible. I stood up from that Christmas table in total silence. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself over keeping the peace. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, you'll understand how this really began. It didn't start with anger. It started with love. My late wife, Claire, and I raised our son believing effort mattered, loyalty mattered, family mattered. We were the kind of household neighbors talked about. Backyard barbecues, road trips in an old SUV, Friday nights cheering too loud at school games. Claire used to joke that our son had my stubborn streak but her heart, and we thought that balance would carry him through life. When cancer took her, everything changed overnight. I sat beside her hospital bed, listening to machines beep in that cold white room, promising I'd finish what we started together. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't let him struggle." Those words stayed with me. I became 2 parents overnight. I worked longer hours, took side jobs, skipped vacations, skipped sleep. My hands were always sore, my back always aching, but I told myself that was just how real men showed love. I said no to rebuilding my own life because I thought being there mattered more. I never imagined that one day that same sacrifice would be used to tell me I didn't belong. I thought love meant endurance, not limits, loyalty without questions, silence instead of confrontation. That night proved I was wrong, and Christmas would never sound the same again. It was the moment I realized respect doesn't come from sacrifice alone. It comes from boundaries you finally choose to keep. And this story begins right there, with consequences nobody expected, including me too. I drove a beat-up pickup truck that rattled every time I hit 40. The kind of truck you keep alive with duct tape, crossed fingers, and sheer stubbornness. Meanwhile, my son pulled up to high school in a clean, dependable sedan on his 16th birthday. When his friends signed up for pricey summer programs, he went too, every single time. Each week cost me overtime I didn't really have, extra shifts I pretended didn't hurt. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming in real time. I was teaching him that love meant someone else always picked up the tab, that someone else would step back, work harder, stay quiet. I was teaching him that he deserved to be carried through life, no questions asked. What I didn't realize was that I was also teaching him to expect it, to normalize it, to stop noticing the weight on my shoulders. He met his wife during his final year of college. She worked on campus, sharp, ambitious, always composed. Her smile was polite but never warm when she looked at me. From the very first dinner, I felt like I was being sized up and found wanting. She watched how I spoke, what I wore, what I ordered. One Sunday, right in front of everyone, she laughed and asked him if I still handled his laundry. The tone was casual, but the message wasn't. He laughed it off, shrugged, and said I liked helping. That was the first time he didn't defend me, not the last. She had opinions about everything, how I cooked, how I decorated, even the coffee brand in my kitchen. She was never openly rude, but there was always this low-grade judgment humming in the background, like static you couldn't turn off. I swallowed it because I wanted my son happy. If she brought him peace, I figured I could handle a little discomfort. I thought compromise was part of family. What I didn't see was how slowly she reframed the story, how she turned support into control, generosity into weakness. When they announced their engagement, I already knew what I wanted to do. My late wife and I had talked about it for years. We'd saved from the time our boy was still learning to walk. Small amounts at first, cash tucked away quietly. After she passed, I kept going. Extra shifts, side work, living small so he could live big. When the number finally hit what we needed, it felt surreal. Enough for a solid family home in a safe neighborhood. 4 bedrooms, yard out back, a future. My lawyer suggested keeping the paperwork in my name for a while. Tax stuff, technicalities. It made sense at the time. I signed every document, imagining grandkids tearing through hallways, Sunday cookouts, noisy holidays. I didn't know those signatures would one day protect me. I thought the hard part was over. The house was perfect. Hardwood floors, 2-car garage, quiet street. I walked through it with the agent, already picturing birthdays and graduations. The down payment wiped me out. The mortgage locked me into working longer than I planned. But when I handed them the keys on their wedding day and saw their faces light up, it felt worth it. For a moment, it felt like family again. That was just the beginning. The payments never stopped. Mortgage, insurance, taxes, repairs. When their first kid arrived, expenses multiplied. Groceries, utilities, phones, internet, medical bills. It was always something, and every request sounded reasonable on its own. I kept records out of habit, not suspicion. I thought I was being responsible. Over time, the numbers added up in ways I didn't want to think about. What I didn't see then was that while I was funding their stability, my place in their lives was shrinking. I was becoming background noise, a wallet, a convenience. And I kept telling myself that this was normal, that families evolved, that stepping back was part of aging. I had no idea I was slowly being written out of my own story. As the years rolled on, the help I gave stopped being framed as love and started being treated like an obligation. They'd thank me, sure, but there was a tone shift I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of thanks that reminds you you're helping, not belonging. My son began echoing his wife's language, talking about independence while never actually refusing my support. They wanted the safety net without the person attached to it. Family dinners became less frequent. When I did visit, conversations felt staged, polite in a way that kept me on the outside. She'd compliment my shirt, then pivot instantly to a work topic I wasn't part of, like she was closing a door with a smile. One afternoon, she suggested I start dating again. Said it was time I focused on myself, found my own life. It sounded caring on the surface, but I heard the message underneath. Step back, be less present, stay useful, just not visible. I told myself she meant well. I always told myself that. I was good at making excuses for people who didn't make space for me. The first time it really stung was Thanksgiving a few years back. I brought my usual dish, the one everyone said they loved. I was setting it down when she casually told her sister that I didn't really contribute much anymore, that I mostly just showed up. The words hit hard. I quietly listed what I paid for, what I covered. She laughed it off, said they'd been handling things on their own for years. I looked to my son, waiting for him to correct her, to say something. He didn't even turn around, told me to let it go, said she was just setting boundaries. I ate in silence, realizing for the first time that silence had become my role. My birthday passed without a single message, no call, no text. I kept checking my phone, convincing myself something was coming. That night, I bought myself a cheap cake and sang quietly at my own table. 2 days later, my son apologized, said things had been hectic, promised to make it up to me. He never did. That's when it hit me how easy it had become for them to forget I existed unless they needed something.
Summer brought neighborhood barbecues and more public moments I'd rather forget. I tried to join a conversation once and was cut off mid-sentence, laughed at for being old school. My son stepped in, not to defend me, but to shut me down. Said I was embarrassing them. I sat in my truck afterward, hands clenched on the steering wheel, wondering when I became someone to manage instead of someone to respect. At home, I started going through old photos, smiling faces, shared moments, proof that what we had was real once. I began noticing patterns during visits, the glances at watches, the quick topic changes, the way their kid disappeared to her room when I arrived. It hurt realizing I'd helped create this. I'd said yes too often. I'd accepted too little. I'd taught them that my presence was optional. By the time December came around again, I doubled down like I always did. Gifts, traditions, effort. I cooked, planned, spent. Their reaction was lukewarm. Talk of keeping things simple, of immediate family. I swallowed the words I wanted to say and agreed to just show up. I told myself flexibility was love. I had no idea that Christmas dinner would be the point of no return. When I walked into that house carrying gifts, the energy shifted. Conversations paused. Smiles felt forced. I sat on the couch feeling like a guest in a place I paid for, listening as everyone else laughed easily together. I told myself to stay calm, to get through the night. I didn't know I was about to be erased out loud.
Dinner started the way these things always do. Polite and careful, everyone choosing words that wouldn't rock the boat. Her parents talked about retirement communities, about downsizing, about how people our age needed to think realistically. The comments floated around the table, never aimed directly at me, but close enough that I felt them land. I kept eating, nodding when it felt expected, telling myself I was reading too much into it. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "Some people struggle to know when it's time to let go. Old habits, old arrangements." The room went quiet in that uncomfortable way where silverware suddenly sounds too loud. Someone joked about independence, about not taking up space. The words felt deliberate. I tried to explain, to remind them gently of what I'd done, what I still did. She cut me off mid-sentence, said this was a family discussion. I realized then they were talking about my future like I wasn't even there, like I was a problem to be solved, not a person with a voice. My chest tightened, but I stayed seated. I always stayed seated. That's when everything spilled out. Years of frustration poured from her in front of everyone. She said I'd been freeloading, that I hovered, that I acted like I ran their lives. My ears rang. I said I paid for the house, the bills, the taxes. She laughed like I'd told a bad joke, said it was ancient history. One gift didn't buy me control forever. I could feel every eye on me. My hands shook so badly I had to set my glass down. I tried to explain calmly. I listed facts, payments, documents, responsibilities, but my voice cracked. I sounded defensive, desperate, not like a man stating truth, but like someone begging to be believed. That's when my son looked at me, face flushed, jaw tight, and told me to shut up, told me I was embarrassing them. The words sucked the air out of the room. Time felt like it stopped. Something inside me went cold. I stood up without saying another word, walked to the door, left my coat, my pride, my explanations behind. I drove with no destination, just letting the road pull me forward. Christmas lights blurred past. Every mile felt heavier than the last. I replayed his words over and over. Each time they hit harder. I ended up sitting in my truck outside a diner, watching strangers laugh together, wondering when love turned into something I gave but never received. That night, I finally admitted what I'd avoided for years. I'd confused sacrifice with love. I'd thought endurance meant loyalty. I'd believed saying yes was the same as being needed. I remembered my wife warning me once that too much giving without boundaries teaches people the wrong lesson. I hadn't listened. I'd raised a man who thought respect was optional. The next morning, I walked into the bank with a purpose I hadn't felt in decades. The safe deposit box felt heavier than it should have. Inside were years of records, deeds, statements, proof. Paper doesn't forget, even when people do. I spread everything out, realizing those boring documents carried more weight than all my explanations ever had. I called my lawyer and told her I needed to talk, not about giving, about protecting what was mine. That night, I looked through old photos one last time, seeing the slow fade I'd ignored. I wasn't angry. I was done. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was choosing dignity. For the first time in a long time, tomorrow felt different.
The lawyer's office smelled the same as it always had. Old books, polished wood, expensive coffee that never quite tasted worth the price. But I felt different sitting there this time. I wasn't there to help my son. I wasn't there to smooth anything over. I laid the documents out on her desk, one by one. Deed, mortgage history, bank transfers, insurance records. Years of quiet proof. She didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly as she flipped through pages that told a story my family had chosen to forget. She looked up and said it plainly. The house was legally mine, always had been. No shared ownership, no gray area. I could ask for rent. I could reclaim possession. I could force a reset they never thought possible. Hearing it out loud felt strange. For years I'd treated that house like it belonged to them emotionally, even though every legal line said otherwise. I asked what fair rent would be. The number she gave me was higher than what I paid for my own place. I sat back and laughed once, short and hollow. I'd been giving more than that every month for over 2 decades. The notice itself was simple, cold, professional. Pay rent or vacate within 30 days. No emotion, no history, just facts. I watched from across the street when it was delivered. She answered the door in casual clothes, signed without reading, closed it like it was junk mail. I drove home feeling oddly calm. That night I ate a quiet dinner and realized I could actually taste the food again. Peace does that. The call came early the next morning. Confusion first, then panic. My son said there had to be a mistake. I corrected him, told him the truth. Silence followed, thick and heavy. When he said I'd given them the house, I told him I'd given them a place to live, not ownership. There was a difference. He asked where they were supposed to go. I told them they had time to figure it out. For once, I didn't offer a solution. After that, the phone didn't stop. Anger, bargaining, accusations. His wife screamed that family doesn't do this to family. I reminded her family doesn't humiliate family either. She went quiet after that. By the end of the week, I'd heard every version of the story. That I was cruel, that I was confused, that I was ruining lives. I turned my phone off and enjoyed the quiet. A few weeks in, I went back to the house to collect my things. My key still worked. Of course it did. I moved slowly, taking only what was mine. Old photos, a watch, small pieces of a life I'd lived for others. The rooms felt hollow, like the house already knew what was coming. I didn't linger. I didn't look back. My apartment was small, but it was mine. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. No noise, no tension. I set things up the way I liked. Coffee by the window, photos where I could see them,
Silence that didn't feel lonely, just clean. I started routines that belonged to me. Morning walks, simple meals, evenings without explaining myself. Weeks passed. The calls slowed, then stopped. I thought it was over. Then one night the phone rang again, different this time. Controlled, careful. I let it go to voicemail. She said they were running out of options. Landlords wanted deposits they couldn't afford. Movers wanted money they didn't have. Reality had finally caught up. Their daughter called next, crying, begging me not to make the move. I listened. I almost broke. Almost. But I remembered how easy it had been for her to ignore me when it suited her. I told her her parents should have thought about that sooner. Gently, honestly. Then her mother called. Then neighbors. Then friends who hadn't spoken to me in years. Everyone had an opinion now. Funny how that works. When consequences arrive, everyone suddenly finds their voice. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I stayed quiet. I'd said enough over the last 22 years. By the time the 30 days were almost up, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy, not proud, just free. And sometimes freedom doesn't feel loud. Sometimes it feels like silence finally choosing you back. The final week arrived quietly, the way big changes often do. No sirens, no warnings, just a calendar date staring back at them. I kept my routines steady. Coffee in the morning, walks in the afternoon, reading at night. I didn't check my phone unless it rang, and it rang less every day. Desperation burns hot at first, then cools into resignation. I could hear it in their voices when they did call. Less anger, more fear. Midweek, my son showed up alone. He looked older than he should have. Shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He didn't waste time pretending everything was fine. He said he knew he'd failed me. Said he'd let things slide, let disrespect turn into habit. He cried. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that sneaks up on you. He said all the right words, the words I'd waited years to hear. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I loved him. Then I told him love wasn't enough anymore. He nodded like he already knew. When he left, I closed the door gently. Some doors don't slam, they just stop opening. 2 days later, his wife came by. I watched through the peephole before opening the door. She looked worn down, no sharp edges left. She apologized, said she'd been wrong, said she was scared. She asked me not to punish my son and their kid for her mistakes. I told her consequences aren't punishments. They're lessons you don't get to skip. She didn't argue. She just stood there, absorbing it. When she left, I felt no satisfaction, just finality. On Friday morning, the process completed. I wasn't there. I didn't want to be. My lawyer called to confirm it was done. No drama, no shouting, keys left behind. I thanked her and hung up. I sat for a long time after that, holding the phone, realizing how strange it felt to have nothing left to fix. That evening, I drove by the house one last time. The yard looked the same, lights off, quiet. I unlocked the door, walked through empty rooms, and placed the old key on the counter. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I locked up with the spare and left without looking back. Back at my apartment, I sat at the table holding 2 keys, one old, worn smooth by years of use, one new, sharp, unfamiliar. They represented 2 lives, one built on giving until there was nothing left, one built on choosing myself without apology. I set the old key down and kept the new one in my pocket. Life didn't magically improve overnight. I still missed my son. I still thought about the kid I helped raise. But the silence no longer hurt. It healed. I learned what I liked, what I wanted, who I was without being needed. The rent from the house covered my bills and then some. Money wasn't the point anymore. Peace was. Sometimes I wonder if they learned anything, if they understand why things happened the way they did. I may never know. What I do know is this: boundaries don't destroy families, they reveal them. And sometimes choosing dignity costs you people who only valued your sacrifice. I didn't walk away out of anger. I walked away because staying meant disappearing, and I wasn't willing to vanish quietly anymore. The weeks after everything settled were quieter than I expected. No chaos, no dramatic fallout, just space. The kind of space you don't realize you've been craving until it finally shows up. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. When it buzzed, I let it. When it didn't, I didn't miss it. Silence had stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like control. I built small routines that belonged only to me. Morning coffee by the window, watching the street wake up. Long walks where nobody knew my name or my story. Grocery shopping without mentally calculating what someone else might want or need. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired. For the first time in years, my life didn't revolve around being available. Every now and then, memories crept in. Random ones. Teaching my son how to drive in an empty parking lot, fixing a bike chain together, sitting on the edge of his bed after his mom passed, promising I'd always be there. Those memories didn't disappear just because the present had changed. They stayed, but they didn't own me anymore. I started noticing how much lighter my body felt, less tension in my shoulders, fewer headaches. I hadn't realized how much stress I'd been carrying until it was gone. When you live in constant emotional negotiation, your body pays the price. I'd normalized it. That was the scariest part. One afternoon, I ran into an old coworker who asked how retirement was treating me. I laughed, told him I wasn't retired, just recalibrated. He said I looked different, happier. I didn't correct him, but I knew the truth was more complicated. I wasn't happier. I was clearer. The house was rented out within a month. Good tenants, quiet, respectful. They paid on time without reminders or drama. Funny how that works. The rent check hit my account, and for the first time, money felt neutral, not loaded with expectation or guilt, just a tool, not a leash. There were nights I wondered if I'd gone too far. That thought usually showed up late when the world got quiet. But then I'd remember the Christmas table, the words, the looks, the way my voice shook while no one stepped in. That memory grounded me, reminded me why this line had to be drawn. A letter arrived from my son a month later, handwritten, short. He said he hoped I was okay, said they were adjusting, said he wished things were different. He didn't ask for anything. That mattered. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it away. Healing doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with distance. I thought about reaching out. I really did. But I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to be pulled back into old patterns. I needed to learn who I was without fixing things first, without smoothing over discomfort, without being the safety net. People talk about forgiveness like it's a switch you flip. It isn't. It's a process. And sometimes the first step isn't forgiving others. It's forgiving yourself for staying too long. I started volunteering a few mornings a week. Nothing heavy, just helping where help was actually appreciated. The contrast was jarring. Gratitude without entitlement. Respect without obligation. It reminded me that my value had never been the problem. On my birthday, I didn't wait for my phone to ring. I took myself out to dinner, ordered what I wanted, dessert included. I didn't sing. I didn't make a wish. I just sat there, present, alive, whole. That felt like progress. I don't know what the future holds with my family. Maybe one day we'll talk. Maybe we won't. What I do know is this: I won't trade my peace to earn a seat at a table where I'm not respected. I've already lived that life. Once was enough. Learning to stand alone didn't make me lonely. It made me honest. And honesty, I've learned, is where real freedom starts.
Time kept moving, whether I was ready for it or not. Seasons changed outside my window, and with each one, something inside me settled a little more. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate endings where someone finally stood up for me. Closure didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It came quietly, disguised as acceptance. Every so often, news about my son reached me through mutual acquaintances. Nothing detailed, just fragments. They'd moved into a smaller place, adjusted their lifestyle, made compromises they'd never had to make before. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, just a distant understanding. Consequences don't celebrate themselves. They just exist. I ran into my son's daughter once at a grocery store, completely by accident. She looked older somehow, taller, more guarded. She hesitated when she saw me, like she wasn't sure which version of me she was allowed to acknowledge. I smiled first, said hello, asked how school was. She answered politely, stiffly, then drifted away. It hurt more than I expected, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Distance teaches kids lessons they never signed up for. That night, I sat with the discomfort instead of pushing it away. I didn't numb it with distractions. I let it be what it was. Grief doesn't disappear just because boundaries are necessary. You can do the right thing and still feel loss. That's something no one warns you about. I started writing things down, not for anyone else, just for me. Moments I remembered, lessons I learned too late, patterns I ignored because facing them felt harder than tolerating them. Seeing it on paper stripped away the excuses. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances, I was a participant. I had choices, even when I told myself I didn't. One entry stood out. I'd written about how often I'd equated being needed with being loved, how being useful had become my identity. Without that role, I'd felt invisible. That realization hit deeper than any insult ever had. I'd built my self-worth around service instead of self-respect, and people treated me accordingly. I began setting small boundaries everywhere else in my life, saying no when I meant no, leaving when I felt uncomfortable, speaking up when something didn't sit right. It was awkward at first, almost painful, but each time I did it, the world didn't collapse. People adjusted, or they didn't. Either way, I survived. There were moments I missed my old role, the fixer, the provider, the one who smoothed everything over. Letting go of that identity felt like losing a limb, but I reminded myself that I hadn't lost anything. I'd returned something that never belonged to me in the first place: responsibility for other adults' choices. A therapist once told me something that stuck. He said, "You can love people deeply and still refuse to bleed for them." That line replayed in my head more than once. Love doesn't require self-erasure. It never did. I just hadn't learned that lesson early enough. I thought about my wife often during this time, wondered what she would say now. I imagined her sitting across from me, listening, nodding slowly. She'd always been better at balance than I was, stronger in ways that didn't shout. I like to think she'd understand why things had unfolded this way. On quiet evenings, I'd sit with a book and a cup of tea, watching the light fade. No noise, no demands, just time passing gently. Peace stopped feeling fragile. It became sturdy, reliable, something I could trust. I didn't know if my family would ever find their way back into my life in a healthy way. I couldn't control that. What I could control was how I showed up for myself. And for the first time, that felt enough.
By the time another Christmas rolled around, the weight of the past year had settled into something quieter, something I could carry without flinching. Decorations went up around the neighborhood like they always did. Lights, wreaths, inflatable Santas leaning sideways in people's yards. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel pulled toward any of it. No obligation, no performance, just observation. I spent that holiday alone, by choice, not circumstance. I cooked a simple meal, nothing fancy, just food I actually liked. No traditions to maintain, no expectations to meet. I turned on an old movie halfway through and let it play while I ate. The silence didn't echo. It rested. That was new. I thought about the table where everything had ended, the looks that followed those words, the way humiliation settles into your bones when it comes from your own child. That memory still hurt, but it no longer controlled me. Pain loses power when it's no longer paired with hope. Accepting that truth took longer than I expected. A few days after Christmas, I received another letter, this one from my son again. Longer this time. He wrote about therapy, about realizing how much he'd avoided conflict by staying silent, how silence had become cruelty without him noticing. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't ask for help, he just acknowledged harm. That mattered more than he probably understood. I didn't reply right away. I read it a few times, folded it, unfolded it, then set it aside. Growth doesn't demand immediate access. Accountability doesn't erase history. I was learning to let things unfold without rushing to rescue them. Friends noticed the change in me before I fully did. They said I seemed calmer, more grounded, less reactive. I stopped explaining myself so much, stopped justifying decisions that felt right in my gut. When you stop over-explaining, you learn quickly who respects you and who only tolerated you. I started traveling small distances. Nothing dramatic, day trips, quiet towns, coffee shops where nobody cared who I was. I liked that anonymity. It reminded me I wasn't defined by my role in anyone else's life. I was just a man moving through the world, allowed to take up space. One afternoon, sitting alone in a cafe, I overheard a couple arguing softly about family obligations, about guilt, about keeping the peace. The phrases hit close to home. I wanted to turn around and tell them what I'd learned the hard way, that peace bought with silence isn't peace at all. It's debt, and it always comes due. I didn't interrupt. Some lessons can't be borrowed. They have to be lived. The house I once thought of as the center of my world had become just a property on paper now. The tenants renewed their lease without fuss. I never drove by anymore. I didn't need to. My memories no longer lived there. They lived in me, and I carried them differently now. I realized something important during that time. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to reopen wounds just to prove they existed. It meant releasing the version of the future I'd clung to for decades, the one where sacrifice guaranteed closeness. That future was never real. It was a story I told myself to survive. As spring approached, I cleaned out old boxes I'd avoided for years. Papers, photos, objects tied to expectations that never materialized. I kept what mattered, let go of the rest. Physical decluttering did something strange to my mind. It made room, space I didn't know I'd needed. I no longer checked my phone hoping for apologies or breakthroughs. If they came, they came. If they didn't, life still moved forward. That realization was liberating in a way nothing else had been. My peace was no longer conditional. I understood now that boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They let the right things through and block what harms you. I spent most of my life with no filter at all, letting everything in and wondering why I felt drained. Standing in my quiet apartment one evening, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, yes, but steadier. No longer shrinking myself to fit into spaces that refused to hold me. That felt like growth. Not loud, not dramatic, just real.
The last thing I learned, and maybe the hardest, was that endings don't always come with clean lines or perfect understanding. Life doesn't tie things up the way stories do. Sometimes it just slows down enough for you to notice you're no longer bleeding. That's how I knew this chapter was closing. Not because everything was fixed, but because it stopped hurting in the same way. I thought often about the man I used to be, the version of me who believed that being needed was the same thing as being loved, the one who mistook exhaustion for virtue and silence for strength. I didn't hate that man. I felt compassion for him. He did the best he could with what he knew at the time, but I didn't want to live as him anymore. There were moments when guilt tried to sneak back in. Late at night, when the world went still, I'd wonder if I'd abandoned my role, if I'd failed some unspoken test of fatherhood. That voice was familiar. It had kept me compliant for years. This time, I questioned it instead of obeying it. I asked myself who benefited from that guilt. The answer was never me. I learned that adulthood doesn't protect people from accountability. Love doesn't cancel consequences, and family doesn't get a free pass to hurt you just because you share blood. Those ideas used to scare me. Now they grounded me. Months passed. Life didn't explode or collapse. It simply continued. I found comfort in that. Stability no longer depended on someone else's approval. My days were mine to shape. My nights were quiet without feeling empty. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I eventually replied to my son's letter, not with anger, not with demands, just honesty. I told him I loved him, that I always had, that I needed time and space to heal, that any future relationship would have to look different than the past, built on respect, not obligation. I didn't ask for a response. I sent it and let it go. Letting go became a practice. I stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen, stopped imagining apologies that might never come. I focused on what was real instead of what I wished could be restored. Reality, I learned, is kinder when you stop fighting it. I also stopped telling this story as a tragedy. It wasn't one. It was a reckoning. A late one, maybe, but necessary. Some people learn boundaries early. Others learn them after decades of pain. Timing doesn't invalidate the lesson. When people ask me now if I regret what I did, I answer honestly. I regret not learning sooner. I regret the years I spent shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. I regret teaching people that access to me didn't require respect. But I don't regret choosing myself when I finally did, not for a second. The house, the money, the paperwork, those were never the point. They were just tools. What mattered was reclaiming my voice, my space, my right to exist without apology. Once I understood that, everything else fell into place. I don't know how this story ends long term. Maybe there will be reconciliation, maybe there won't. I've made peace with either outcome. That peace didn't come from winning. It came from stopping the loss.
If there's one thing I'd say to anyone listening who feels trapped by obligation, it's this. Love doesn't require self-destruction. Sacrifice isn't supposed to erase you. And walking away from disrespect doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. I didn't stand up from that table to punish anyone. I stood up because staying seated meant disappearing. I took my keys, not just to a house, but to a life that finally belonged to me. And that's where this part of the story ends. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with a man who finally learned that dignity isn't something you earn by giving everything away. It's something you protect, even when it costs you the people who never learned how to value it.
I locked my door that night with a key that belonged only to me. No shared copies, no explanations owed. Just a quiet click that sounded like the end of something heavy. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the knob, realizing how long it had been since a space felt like mine. Pause for a second and really think about this. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, swallowed the disrespect, and told yourself family comes first? Or would you have stood up, taken your keys, and walked away like I did? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Later that night, I did something I'd never done before. I talked out loud to my late wife. No big speech, no drama, just honesty. I told her I finally understood what she meant all those years ago, that love without limits isn't love at all, it's permission, and I'd given too much of it away. The strange part was how calm I felt saying it, like the lesson had finally landed. The months that followed proved something else to me. Independence isn't about money alone, but it sure helps. The income from the house covered my needs, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't financially tied to people who didn't respect me. I still loved my son. I probably always will. That never changed. What changed was my understanding of where love ends and self-respect begins. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. Sometimes respect doesn't come from hoping harder, but from drawing a line and standing behind it. And sometimes family isn't about staying at the table no matter how badly you're treated, but knowing when to stand up and leave. I'm not proud of how long it took me to learn this, but I am proud that I finally did. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt taken for granted by people you sacrificed for, you're not alone. And if you enjoy stories about reclaiming dignity, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself without guilt, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you'd like to support this channel and help me keep bringing real stories like this to life, you can send a super thanks. It genuinely means more than you know. On your screen now are 2 more stories I think you'll connect with deeply. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until the next story, take care of yourself and choose respect.